Learn English through story. The portrait. In a small, picturesque town, there lived an artist named Henry, known far and wide for his extraordinary talent in painting portraits. People traveled from neighboring cities to have their likeness captured by his skilled hand. Henry's portraits weren't just realistic, they seemed to capture the very essence of a person's soul. His studio was filled with vibrant colors, the scent of oil paints, and the hum of creativity that seemed to flow endlessly. Despite his fame and success, Henry was a solitary man. He lived alone in a modest house at the edge of town, with only his easel and brushes for company. He had never married and had few close friends. Though people admired his work, they often found Henry himself to be distant, almost aloof. He was a man who had mastered the art of observing others, but who kept his own heart carefully guarded. One day, a wealthy businessman named Mr. Crawford commissioned Henry to paint a portrait of his wife, Lydia. She was a beautiful woman, elegant and poised, but with a sadness in her eyes that intrigued Henry from the moment they met. As Lydia sat for her portrait, Henry noticed how her smile never quite reached her eyes, and how her gaze seemed to wander as if searching for something just out of reach. "Is something troubling you, Mrs. Crawford?" Henry asked gently, breaking the silence that usually filled his studio. Lydia looked at him, surprised by his question. "Why do you ask?" "Your eyes," Henry replied, carefully mixing paints on his palette. "They tell a different story than your smile." Lydia hesitated, as if weighing whether to confide in him. Finally, she sighed. "I suppose there's no harm in telling you. My life is not as perfect as it may seem. My husband is a good man, but he is more concerned with his business and wealth than with our marriage. I often feel like a decorative piece in his life, like one of the paintings on his walls. Beautiful, perhaps, but ultimately meaningless." Henry listened quietly, understanding more about the woman before him than he had expected. He had painted many faces over the years, but few had revealed their inner struggles to him so openly. He found himself wanting to capture not just Lydia's outer beauty, but the depth of her unspoken sorrow. As the days passed, Henry and Lydia continued their sessions, and a quiet bond began to form between them. Lydia found herself looking forward to their time together, as Henry's presence was calming, and his silent understanding made her feel less alone. Henry, too, found himself drawn to Lydia in a way that surprised him. He had spent so many years distancing himself from others, fearing that emotional entanglements would interfere with his art. But with Lydia, he felt a connection that went beyond mere observation. When the portrait was finally completed, Henry was both proud and troubled by what he had created. The painting was undeniably beautiful, capturing Lydia's grace and elegance. But it also conveyed the sadness in her eyes, the longing in her heart. It was a true reflection of the woman she was, not just the facade she presented to the world. When Mr. Crawford came to collect the portrait, he was immediately struck by its beauty. "You've outdone yourself, Henry," he said, admiring the painting. "My wife looks stunning." But as he studied the portrait more closely, his expression changed. "Why does she look so broken bar sad?" he asked, frowning. Henry hesitated, unsure of how to respond. "I painted what I saw," he said simply. Mr. Crawford's eyes narrowed. "I didn't pay you to paint her sadness, Henry. I wanted a portrait that shows how happy she is, how happy we are together." Henry felt a pang of guilt, knowing that he had revealed a truth that Mr. Crawford did not want to see. "I'm sorry if the painting is not what you expected," he said, his voice steady. "But I believe that art should reflect reality, not just what we wish to see." Mr. Crawford was silent for a moment, his gaze shifting between the portrait and Henry. Finally, he sighed. "Perhaps you're right," he said reluctantly, "but this is not what I wanted." He paid Henry and took the portrait, but Henry could tell that Mr. Crawford was displeased. As he left the studio, Henry felt a deep sense of unease. He had always prided himself on capturing the truth in his work, but now he wondered if he had overstepped, revealing too much of Lydia's inner world. A few days later, Lydia returned to the studio alone. She looked different, more at peace, as if a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. She approached Henry with a soft smile. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what?" Henry asked, surprised. "For showing me what I needed to see," Lydia replied. "The portrait was a wake-up call for my husband and me. It forced us to confront the distance between us, something we had both been avoiding. We've had some difficult conversations since then, but I believe we're on the path to something better." Henry felt a warmth in his chest that he hadn't experienced in a long time. "I'm glad to hear that," he said sincerely. Lydia reached out and gently touched his hand. "Your art has done more than just capture my likeness, Henry. It's helped us see the truth, and for that, I will always be grateful." As Lydia left the studio, Henry stood by the window, watching her disappear down the street. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of his solitude lift, replaced by a quiet sense of fulfillment. He realized that his art had the power to change lives, not just by capturing what was on the surface, but by revealing the deeper truths that lay beneath. In that moment, Henry knew that his portraits would never be the same. He would continue to paint with honesty and integrity, knowing that sometimes, the most important things to capture were not the things people wanted to see, but the things they needed to see. I hope you enjoyed the story. If you enjoyed, then please like and share this video, and don't forget to subscribe our YouTube channel. Thank you for watching.